The drive out to my mother's house takes 47 minutes from where I live, and I know every mile of it by heart. The low hills outside of Dayton, the bend where the creek runs close to the road, the stretch of county highway where the trees grow so thick on both sides that even in November you feel like you're passing through a tunnel. I had driven that road hundreds of times in my life, coming home for holidays, coming home for emergencies, coming home just because she called and said the gutters needed cleaning and she didn't want to ask anyone else. I drove it the morning after she died, too, though I don't remember much of that particular trip. I remember parking in front of the house and sitting in the car for a long time before I could make myself go inside. My mother's name was Eleanor. She was 71 years old, and she died in early October from a stroke that the doctors said was sudden and, in all likelihood, painless. That is what they tell you. And I have spent a lot of time deciding whether or not to believe it. I choose to believe it. There are some choices you make not because they are supported by evidence, but because the alternative is something you cannot carry. She had lived in that house for 33 years. She and my father bought it the year my younger brother turned 2, and she stayed in it after my father passed, and she stayed in it after my brother and I both grew up and moved away, and she would have stayed in it until she couldn't anymore, except that the stroke made that decision for her. She had a vegetable garden in the backyard that she tended every spring without fail. She had a sewing room on the second floor, full of fabric she was always meaning to get to. She had a kitchen that smelled like coffee and dish soap and something underneath that I could never name, but that I associate entirely with the word home. 8 months after she died, I started the process of getting the house ready to sell. My brother, his name is Dennis, had made it clear early on that he had no interest in handling the estate. He lived out in Arizona, he said. It was too far. It was too hard emotionally. He had a lot going on with work. I was closer, geographically and otherwise, so the responsibility fell to me, and I accepted it the same way I had accepted most things in my life, that fell to me by default, without complaint, and with the quiet understanding that this was simply how things worked. The house needed some attention before it could go on the market. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of accumulated maintenance that a woman living alone in her 70s hadn't been able to keep up with. Some of the hardwood floors in the main hallway and the front bedroom had warped badly over the years, soft spots developing near the baseboards where water had gotten in from a slow leak in the wall. I hired a flooring contractor named Ray to assess it and give me a quote. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a gray beard and the particular kind of quiet competence that good tradespeople carry with them, not unfriendly, but focused, someone whose attention was always partly on the floor even when he was looking at you. He came on a Wednesday morning in early June. I walked him through the hallway and into the front bedroom, and he crouched down near the baseboard and pressed his thumb into the wood and nodded slowly in the way that contractors nod when they are confirming what they already suspected. He told me the subfloor underneath had been compromised by moisture and that several sections would need to come up entirely. I asked him how long it would take. He said he could probably have it done in 2 days if he started that Friday. I told him that would work and we shook hands, and I drove back home. He called me that Friday afternoon, maybe 3 hours after he had started. I was sitting at my desk at work when my phone buzzed, and I saw it was his number, and something in me, some instinct I couldn't have explained, went quiet before I even answered. He said, "I found something under the floor in the bedroom. I think you should come out here. I'd rather not leave it until you see it for yourself." I asked him what it was. He paused for a moment, and then he said, "I don't know exactly. It's a metal box, padlocked." It was sitting down in a section of the subfloor that looks like it was cut and reseated deliberately, not like the damage from the leak. Someone put it there on purpose. I just thought you should see it before I moved anything. I left work 20 minutes later. Ray was standing in the hallway when I arrived, and he walked me into the bedroom without saying much. The floor had been pulled up in a wide section near the far wall, exposing the raw joists below. Sitting between 2 of the joists, resting in the dark space beneath what had once been my mother's bedroom floor, was a gray metal lockbox, roughly the size of a shoebox, secured with a combination padlock, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. The kind that would stop a stranger but not someone who knew to look. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Ray said, quietly, "You want me to give you a minute?" I said yes. He stepped out into the hallway, and I heard him walk toward the kitchen. I climbed down carefully and lifted the box out of the space. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to the bare floor near the window and sat cross-legged in front of it, looking at the lock. My mother had a system for combinations. She had used it my whole life. The year my parents were married, reversed. I turned the dial. It opened. Inside was a brown envelope, sealed with packing tape and thick enough that it had some weight to it. Beneath the envelope was a smaller sealed bag, the plastic kind, with a zip closure containing what looked like a flash drive and a folded piece of notebook paper. On the outside of the brown envelope, in my mother's handwriting, in the careful, slightly formal cursive she always used when she was writing something that mattered, were 4 words. For Thomas. Only Thomas. Thomas is my name. I didn't open it there. I sat with it in my hands for a while, and then I put it carefully back in the box and put the lid on and carried it out to my car. I told Ray I needed to step out for a bit and that he should keep going. He nodded and didn't ask any questions, and I have thought about that several times since his willingness to simply let me have whatever that moment was without making it into something he was part of. I am grateful for that. I drove to the end of my mother's street, to the small Methodist church on the corner where she had attended services for most of her adult life. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the car. It was a warm June afternoon and the light was coming through the windshield at a low angle and everything outside was very bright and very still. I opened the envelope there. Inside were bank statements, 12 months of them, printed out and organized in order by date, with certain lines highlighted in yellow and certain amounts circled in blue ink. My mother had always been meticulous about paperwork. She kept files going back decades in a metal cabinet in the basement. This was consistent with the same careful, systematic approach to documentation that she had applied to everything she had ever needed to track. The statements were from a joint account. The joint holder was my brother, Dennis. I did not understand what I was looking at immediately. Dennis had been added to a secondary account. Years ago, she had mentioned it to me once, in passing, as a practical measure, something about making sure bills could be paid if she was ever hospitalized. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I thought nothing of it now as I began reading. But then I started looking at the circled amounts, and I started looking at the dates, and I started understanding what my mother had been showing me. Over the course of 14 months, beginning about 2 years before she died, money had been moved out of that account in regular, uneven increments. Not a single large transfer that might trigger an alert. Small ones, $1,400, $800, $2,200, $1,900, always just under amounts that would draw attention, always spaced out by 2 or 3 weeks. The highlighted lines showed the balance falling, month by month, in a pattern that no ordinary household expense could explain. The circled amounts added up to just over $60,000. I sat in that church parking lot until the sun moved behind the tree line. Then I unfolded the piece of notebook paper from the plastic bag. My mother's handwriting was very familiar to me. She had written me letters my whole life through college, through the years I lived in different cities, through the periods when we didn't talk on the phone as often as we should have. I knew the slant of it and the way she formed her capital letters and the places where she bore down harder on the pen when she was writing something she felt strongly about. The note was 2 pages, front and back, and the handwriting was smaller than her usual but steady. It had the quality of something written deliberately, over time, with each word chosen. She had discovered the discrepancies by accident, she wrote. She had been reviewing her accounts before a routine appointment with her accountant and noticed that her balance was lower than it should have been. At first, she thought it was her own error. She went back through her records and found the first withdrawal she couldn't account for, and then she found the second, and the third, and the fourth. She did not go to the bank immediately. She went home and sat with it for 2 days. Then she had done what she had always done when something troubled her. She had started a file. She wrote that she had known for certain it was Dennis, after the 6th transaction. When she cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with records she pulled from her phone text messages, in which Dennis had discussed handling some bills on her behalf, asked her to confirm she was fine with a transfer for a specific amount, framed in ways that sounded helpful and routine. She had given her permission, in those messages, not knowing what she was actually approving. He had been careful. He had been patient. He had used her trust the way you would use a tool you had spent years sharpening. She wrote that she had not told me because she was afraid. Not afraid of Dennis, exactly, or not only that. She wrote that she had spent a long time examining what she was afraid of, and she had concluded that it was this, the destruction of something that could not be rebuilt. She wrote that she had watched what had happened in other families when money became the thing that broke them, and she had watched it happen fast and irreversibly, and she had carried the fear of that her whole life. She wrote that Dennis had struggled since childhood in ways I had not had to struggle, and that she had spent decades trying to compensate for that, and that she understood now she had compensated in ways that had not helped him, and had perhaps made this possible. She wrote that she was not making excuses for him. She wrote that she had made her peace with the money, that at her age, with her needs, she would not miss it in any practical sense that mattered. What she could not make her peace with was the lie, the patience of it, the fact that someone she had raised had looked at her care for him and had seen, instead of something to honor, something to use. She had spent several months collecting everything, the bank statements, the messages, records of the withdrawals alongside his requests, notes she had written to herself about each transaction as she confirmed it. She had put it all on the flash drive. She had printed the statements because she didn't entirely trust that the drive would be found or read. She had sealed everything together and put it somewhere only someone who knew the combination to that lockbox would find it. She knew I would be the one to handle the house. She knew I would be thorough. Near the end of the second page, her handwriting got slightly slower, more deliberate. I can tell the difference when she was being careful about what she was saying. She wrote that she was not asking me to burn his life down. She wrote that she understood, if I needed to report it, that she had documented everything for that purpose. She wrote that she trusted me to make the right decision about what to do and how to do it, not because she was washing her hands of it, but because she knew me, and she knew I would not do something I couldn't live with, and she believed that the thing I couldn't live with and the right thing were the same thing in this case. She wrote that she loved Dennis. She wrote that she loved me. She wrote that she was sorry for leaving me with it, and that she knew that was a thing to be sorry for. The last line said, "I kept quiet because I thought I was protecting the family. I'm telling you now because I think the family needs the truth more than it needs the quiet." I did not call Dennis that night. I did not call him the next night either. I drove home from the church and then I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window for a long time looking at the backyard. The thing about grief is that it layers. You think you have worked through most of it, and then something opens a different room, and you discover there was more inside the house than you realized. What I was feeling that night was not only about the money, and it was not only about Dennis, and it was not only about the betrayal, though it was about all of those things. It was also about my mother sitting alone in that bedroom, having figured out what her son had done, going over those statements again and again in her careful way, making her file, reaching her conclusions, and then carrying all of it by herself because she was afraid that telling anyone would cost her something she couldn't replace. She had been alone with it for over a year. I kept coming back to that. I thought about the drives out to the house, all the Friday evenings I'd sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee while she talked about the garden and the neighbors and whatever book she was reading. She had been carrying this during those conversations. She had been carrying it the whole time. I went and got the notebook paper and read it again. The part that stopped me was not the accounting of what Dennis had done, though, that was thorough enough to make me cold every time I read it. The part that stopped me was the sentence about the family. The family needs the truth more than it needs the quiet. I had been thinking about that line since the parking lot, and I kept arriving at the same place. She had decided, in the end, that there had been enough quiet, that she could leave me the quiet or she could leave me the truth, and she had chosen the truth, and she had trusted me to know what to do with it. I called my attorney the following Monday morning. Her name is Carol, and she had handled my mother's estate. I told her I needed to come in. I told her it was about the estate and that I had documentation. I did not tell her anything else over the phone. She said she could see me Thursday. I spent the days between going through the flash drive. My mother had organized it with the same system she had applied to everything else, folders, labeled clearly, in chronological order. There were photographs of her phone screen showing Dennis's texts alongside the corresponding withdrawal dates. There were PDFs of the bank statements, annotated with the same blue ink as the printed copies. There was a document she had created herself. A simple 2-column table that listed each transaction, the date, the amount, the corresponding message, and her note confirming that no legitimate expense accounted for the withdrawal. She had built a case the way you would build a case if you wanted someone to be able to use it. She had built it carefully, and she had built it complete. I thought about that as I went through it. My mother at her kitchen table, or at the small desk she kept in the corner of the sewing room, working through this systematically, alone, adding to it over months. She had been a school librarian for 22 years before she retired. She knew how to organize information. She knew how to document things so that someone else could follow the trail. She had done it for me. The meeting with Carol was on a Thursday afternoon in late June. I brought the box, the documents, the flash drive, and a printed copy of the letter. Carol read through everything without saying much. She asked a few precise questions about when the account had been established, whether Dennis had any legitimate access to funds for estate purposes, whether there were any other accounts they had shared. I answered what I could. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me directly and said, "This is thorough. Your mother was very thorough." I told her I knew. She told me what the options were. I already knew the broad strokes from my own research in the days before, but I listened carefully because Carol doesn't pad things, and every sentence she says has a specific purpose. She told me that given the documentation, if this were reported, the evidence was sufficient to support a civil case and potentially referral to the county prosecutor's office for criminal financial elder abuse. She told me I had standing to pursue recovery of assets from the estate. She told me I could also choose to confront Dennis privately and demand restitution without involving the courts, though she noted that without some formal framework, that kind of agreement tended to be difficult to enforce. I asked her which she would recommend. She said it wasn't her place to recommend. She said it was her place to make sure I understood what each path meant and that I made the decision with clear information. I told her to file. She asked if I was certain. I said yes. She said she would need a few days to prepare the initial documents and that she would be in touch. I thanked her and picked up my mother's letter from the table where Carol had set it down. On the way to my car, I stopped in the parking lot and stood in the sun for a moment. It was a hot day, the kind of Thursday afternoon in Ohio that feels like summer has fully committed. I could hear traffic from the road. I thought about whether I should call Dennis before the papers were served. I turned that question over for a long time, standing there in the heat. There was a version of this in which I called him and told him what I had found and gave him the chance to say something, to explain, to at minimum acknowledge what he had done before the formal process began. I could hear the argument for that. There was also a version of this in which calling him first meant he had time to move money, to create counterclaims, to construct a story that made my mother's careful documentation harder to present as what it was. But there was also a third thing, which was not strategic, which was simply this. I did not have anything to say to him yet. I did not have words. I had spent the better part of 2 weeks doing the practical work of this reviewing documents, meeting attorneys, making decisions, and I had been able to do that work because I had kept the rest of it at a distance. I was not ready to put myself in a room with my brother's voice. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. Carol filed the civil complaint on a Friday in mid-July. Dennis was served at his home in Arizona the following Tuesday. He called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that go too. He texted me 3 times in a row, the messages getting shorter and more stripped down each time, until the last one was just, "Tom, please." I read them and set the phone down on the kitchen table. I am not proud of having no response for him. I am also not ashamed of it. There are things for which words are not the right tool, at least not immediately, and the right thing to do when words are not the right tool is not to force them. I have my mother's practicality in me, if nothing else. There is a part of this story that I come back to often, which is not about Dennis or the money or the legal proceedings. The legal side of things found its resolution, in time a negotiated settlement, restitution, no criminal charges filed in the end, though the documentation was compelling enough that the offer came quickly and the amount was substantial. Carol handled it with the same directness she handles everything. It was resolved by late autumn. What I come back to is the floor. Ray finished the work the week after I found the box. He sent me a text when it was done, no fanfare, just a photo of the refinished hallway and a note that said it had come out well. I drove out to see it the following weekend. The house was quiet and already beginning to feel like a house rather than a home, the particular shift that happens when a place stops being lived in. I walked through the rooms slowly, the way you do when you're trying to hold something you know you're in the process of letting go. I went into the front bedroom last. The floor was smooth and even, sanded back to a uniform color, sealed and finished, no sign of what had been underneath. I stood in the middle of it for a while. I thought about my mother deciding where to put the box. I thought about her reasoning through it, not the box hidden in a drawer, not tucked behind a panel in the closet, but under the floor in this room. This was her bedroom, the room where she slept for 33 years, the room where she probably lay awake on more than one night, running the numbers in her head, reading those bank statements again in the dark, making decisions about what she could carry and what she needed someone else to carry for her. She had put it where she slept, because that was how she kept it. She lived on top of it because she had decided to. That was her choice, and she made it deliberately, and I have spent a lot of time since deciding whether I understand it. I think I do understand it, actually. Not agree with it, necessarily. Not in the sense that I would have made the same choice I would have told her. If I had found out that someone was taking from the people I loved, I would have made noise. But I am a different person than my mother was. And she knew that, too. And part of what she was doing with that letter was telling me so. I kept quiet because I thought I was protecting the family. She was the kind of person who protected the family by absorbing things, by keeping the surface smooth so the people she loved didn't have to feel the disruption. She had done it her whole life. She did it one final time, and she did it as carefully as she had done everything else. The part that I hold is not that she protected him. It's that she protected me. She did not want me to have to be the one who called the police on my brother while she was alive and could still see what it cost both of us. She did not want to put me in that position in real time, with her watching. She gave me the documentation, and she gave me the decision, and she gave me the timing, and she arranged it so that I would be alone with it first, in the quiet, before anyone else knew, so that I could understand before I had to act. She trusted me to handle it. That is not a small thing. Ray had done good work on the floor. It was level and solid, and the finish was even from wall to wall. You could not tell, standing in that room, that anything had ever been different. I stood there long enough that the light from the window crossed the room and started to follow it against the baseboard on the far wall. Then I picked up the lockbox from where I'd left it in the corner and carried it out to the car. I still have it. I have thought about what to do with it, throw it out, donate it somewhere, leave it in the back of a closet and stop thinking about it. But every time I think about actually getting rid of it, I find I'm not ready yet. It sits on a shelf in my garage, empty, the padlock hanging open on the latch. It is a strange thing to keep. I am aware that it is a strange thing to keep. I keep it because it is the last thing my mother prepared for me. It is the last careful, methodical, deliberate act she performed on my behalf. She gathered the evidence, and she wrote the letter, and she put it somewhere she trusted I would find it, and she believed correctly, as it turned out, that I would know what to do. She was also very brave. I have thought about that a great deal. The kind of bravery that doesn't look like bravery from the outside. The kind that happens in quiet rooms and shows up in bank statements and 2 pages of careful handwriting. She was afraid, and she was tired, and she was alone with something no mother should be alone with, and she handled it with a thoroughness and a dignity that I am still measuring myself against. The house sold in early November to a young couple from Columbus who were looking for their first home. I did the walkthrough with the realtor the week before closing and stood one last time in the empty rooms. The floors were clean and even throughout. The sewing room upstairs smelled faintly of fabric and cedar. The kitchen was bare. I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes before I left. The window above the sink looked out on the backyard, where my mother's vegetable garden had already been turned under for the season. She had asked a neighbor to tend it after her last fall, and the neighbor had done so all through the spring and summer, right up until I had needed to let it go with the property. I did not feel sentimental about selling the house. I had expected to, but I didn't. The house was just a house now. What had made it something else had never been in the walls or the floors or the windows. It had been in the person who lived there, and she had already left, and she had left me the things I actually needed. The drive back takes 47 minutes. I know every mile of it. On that particular evening, in November, I drove it in the dark, the headlights picking up the bend near the creek and the long tunnel of trees, and the whole road was familiar and quiet, and I thought about her the whole way home.